И седа скажем, чего ради прозвася Печерский монастырь.
So let it be told how the Pechersk monastery got its name. There was a noble man, Larion by name, who was a scribe and a faster, and wandered from Beresta hill to Dnipro hill, where now the old Pechera monastery is situated, and prayed. The forest here was huge. He dug out a small cave 2 sazhens deep. Nestor the chronicler, the chronicle of the past years. The key of Pechersk Lavra of the Assumption. The Lavra consists of a number of monasteries created in different times. The monastery of the far caves was the first to be built, then the near caves monastery, and after that the upper Lavra on the hill. The last one was the Bolnitsky monastery at the beginning of the 12th century. Everything began the following way. There was a noble man from the town of Lubech, and God inhabited him by the wish to wander all over there, and he went to the holy mountain, and he liked the monasteries there, and he liked the monk's way of life, and he came to one of the monasteries, and he took monastic vows. When Antonius came to Kiev, and began to speculate on where he could live, and visited all the monasteries, and did not like any of them because God did not want it, and he began to wander over thickets and hills, and he was looking for the place that God would show him, and he came to the cliff where Larion had dug out the cell, and he settled there, and he began praying to God, saying with tears, "My Lord, sanction me in this place, and let it be the place of the holy mountain blessing, and of my igumen who administered my oath." One day, Theodosius, who is considered to be the second founder of the Lavra, visited Antonius. He had dreamed of a monk's life from the very childhood. Besides, he had a lot of troubles with his mother when a child, because she wanted him to be like all the other children. She was rather cruel towards him, and he tried to run away from her. But as Theodosius later told Nestor the chronicler, this irascible woman overtook him and pulled the saint by his hair, threw him to the ground, and trampled him down. In the end, however, he was able to escape from her, and he hid so well that she could not find him any more. He drifted to the caves. In time, Theodosius would become the Father Superior of this monastery. He was a superbly good master, both in the realm of spirit and in housekeeping. He was a real ascetic, living according to the Epicurean system, on stale bread, unboiled water and greens, without any butter or oil. At night he slept in a sitting position, because night is an unpleasant time for a monk, when, as is known, the intent eye of control is closed and the fire of imagination is inaccessible to conscience. Theodosius slept sitting, and sometimes did not sleep at all, so that the devil could not seize him at night. Varangian merchants used to hide their goods in the caves where later the underground monastery was situated. Hazar merchants also did that, so these caves could be named Hazar as well. Varangians wandered from Scandinavia to Greece along the Dnipro and had a hiding place in the mountains. Varangians were ancestors of the Kiev dynasty of the Rurikoviches, and that is why one of the Rurikoviches, a son of Yaroslav the Wise, built a temple to Saint Michael near the Dnipro as a reminder of his forefathers wandering there. In Varangian caves and in the caves of natural origin, a fraternity came to live. Those were the people who came to Antonius and stayed with him. Thus, Pechera, or the Pechersk monastery, came to life. the caves became a place of settlement for comparatively few people. The monastery became so popular that new lay brothers kept coming, and many of them had to live outside the caves. The caves had been dug out, but it was somewhat dangerous to live there. A tragedy had taken place at the Zvirinetsky monastery in Kiev, when the caves collapsed and a lot of monks perished. That's why the caves were inhabited by a comparatively small number of people. Finally, they were transformed into a necropolis, a burial ground. Many of the Lavra monks did not decay after burial. Undoubtedly, this is a certain sign. Atheists tried to explain that by special peculiarities of ground, but the ground in Kiev is very much the same everywhere. People decay after their death, but not in the Lavra. Isn't it a sign of holiness and the Lavra's connection to God? After Theodosius, a lot of other monks came to the monastery, which Antonius disliked because he was a real monk. The word derives from the word monos, that is, one who is into solitude. In order to seclude himself, Antonius, together with a couple of his friends and anachorites, moved to the near caves, founding the near caves or Antonius's monastery. The monastery of the Upper Lavra, together with the main Uspensky or Assumption Cathedral, was erected on the plateau granted to Pechersk-Monsk by the Prince of Kiev. Theodosius sent one of the fraternity brothers to Kiev, Prince Izaslav, to say the following: "My prince, it is God who augments the fraternity, but there is not enough place. Could you pass us the hill that is situated over the cave?" Izaslav heard this and was glad, and he sent his people and gave them the hill. The Assumption Cathedral was founded here, and it took a rather long time to build, for different reasons. The temple was decorated by a group of Greek foremen who taught the would-be ingenious painter Alypius, one of the Pechersk monks. Alypius of Pechersk was destined to become the foreman of global significance. His creations still impress the viewer with their perfection. This painter was extremely popular during his lifetime. Princes and boyars wanted to have in their possession the icons painted by him, for instance, patron of art and man of high culture, Prince Volodymyr Monomach. At the same time, Monomach made a point of never visiting the Lavra, because he supported the Vidubitsky monastery but not the Lavra one. He was not able to have a private arrangement with Alypius. However, he found in one of Podil churches a couple of Alypius's icons and bought them. One of them was later sent to Rostov, where his winter residence was situated. Nowadays the icon, which is called the icon of Yaroslav Range, is in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. The Assumption Cathedral had not been finished when Theodosius died in the far caves. Nestor the chronicler had made an initiative to rebury Theodosius 20 years after his death. After so much time passed, he was keen to see the body of his patron. He saw that the body of Theodosius had not decayed, but transformed into relicts. When Saint Theodosius was being buried here in the Assumption Cathedral, monks observed a miracle and a sign. 3 fire columns had come from the east and had stopped on top of the church where the body of the saint was being reburied. The Assumption Cathedral itself was built by Saint Theodosius in the place that was also determined by a sign. There was a thicket there, and Theodosius decided to appeal to God in order to find out where the church had to be built. Theodosius said that it was going to be in the place that would be out of dew in the morning, while the dew would be all over around the place. And so it happened. Next time, Theodosius asked God to send morning dew only to the place of the future temple, while everywhere around there would be no dew. The same place had been pointed. Finally, the thicket burned away in the form of a rectangle, leaving no doubt that it was the right place to build the Assumption Church, the main church of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. At the beginning of the 12th century, the so-called Bolnitsky monastery appeared. Its name derived from the fact that here a hospital for old and sick monks was situated. The foundation of the monastery had been financed by Chernihiv Prince Svetoslav, who became a monk and took the name of Mykola. That is why in the Lavra he was known as Mykola Svetosha, which means Mykola Hypocrite. He fulfilled all the duties of a monk, like chopping wood or carrying water for cooking. Having a lot of money, the former prince spent it for monastery buildings. He financed the Troitska, or Trinity Gate Church, where he fulfilled duties of a housekeeper. This church is the main, the sacred entrance to the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. Historically, the Bolnitsky monastery is especially interesting because on the basis of it the first school of Western European kind for young Orthodox men was founded, where they could study Latin, Plato and Aristotle, and had to comprehend how close antique and Christian cultures were. It was, so to say, the prototype of the Kyiv Mohila Academy. It was quite new for the Orthodox world, as members of the Orthodox Church were known for their excessive conservatism. Any Western influence was also rejected by Zaporizhian Cossacks. When they found out about the school, they came from Podil in order to kill all those they called Latinics. One of the students, the future Metropolitan of Kyiv Sylvester Kosiv, remembers: "We were going to part with our lives, imagining Dnipro sturgeons eating our poor corpses." But the authority of Petro Mohila worked, and on the basis of this monastery, a school with a new curriculum was founded. Then the school had been joined to the so-called Brotherhood School in Podil. Thus, the famous Kyiv Mohila Academy, which was practically the only source of spreading European knowledge all over the Orthodox world, including Syria, Moscow and Serbia, had appeared. As a rule, Cossacks' leadership was very well educated thanks to the fact that all of them had graduated from the Kyiv Mohila Academy. The Trinity Gate Church was built at the beginning of the 12th century, and in the 18th century it was decorated in the European style. The work had been carried out under the guidance of the brilliant artist Alipius Halik, who took this name after his ingenious predecessor Alipius of Pechersk. Alipius Halik decorated the church inside and outside. Unfortunately, his external wall paintings were destroyed in the 19th century. The commission that had destroyed the Europeanized Baroque paintings planned to do that inside the church as well, but they were late because it had taken too long to destroy similar paintings in the Assumption Church, and the paintings of the Trinity Gate Church were saved. The Trinity Gate Church possesses an icon in which a saint has portrait features of Russian Emperor Peter I. At that time, two dynasties struggled for the right to rule Russia. One of them originated from Peter and was represented by Elizabeth, and the other one derived from Tsar Ioan V and was represented by Empress Anna. The Lavra gave its support to Peter's dynasty. Peter I gave much money for rebuilding the Lavra after the big fire in 1718. When he was told about the catastrophic fire in the Lavra, he burst into tears. Peter respected the Lavra because he had got moral support from one of the monks at a critical moment of his life. In 1706, he came to Kiev for strengthening the city during a war with Sweden. Swedes were about to win at the moment. During a reception in the Lavra, he was nervous and broke a cup. It was a very unpleasant sign. But a Lavra monk encouraged him, saying, "The way you broke this cup, you will beat your enemies." Peter was comforted by these words, and after he defeated Swedes near Poltava, he gratefully remembered the monk as a prophet. Hetman Mazepa was the patron of the Upper Lavra. Thanks to him, the huge and high monastery wall, corner tower altars, and 2 churches were erected. One of the churches was the Всесвятска, All Saints Church, above the so-called Economic Gate, and another one was St. Onufri's Church, that had to be the mausoleum for Mazepa. But there were no services in the church, and Mazepa used it for keeping a part of his treasure. As is known, he was a poet, a hetman, and a merchant. After the Poltava battle, Peter I confiscated the treasures and used them for struggling with Swedes and Mazepa's host. Peter I did everything to annihilate the memory of Mazepa. But it so happened that Voltaire described Mazepa in such detail that Byron got interested and created a poem, Mazepa, on the basis of these impressions. As Byron was one of the most prominent figures in Romantic literature at that time, nearly all the Romantic poets of Europe, including Hugo, Pushkin and Blavatsky, went on to write poems about Mazepa. However, in Ukraine, one of the poets who had earlier extolled Mazepa, Stefan Yavorsky by name, wrote lines of the opposite content following the so-called betrayal of Mazepa. "The hell is waiting for him, our former leader Mazepa." As Mazepa was a patron and a financier of many churches and monasteries, his portraits hung there. Sometime later, the Russian Tsar Nicholas I was unpleasantly surprised and irritated by that. He observed the image of Mazepa in the Lavra and asked a monk, "Why is he here?" The answer was, "Because he is the founder of our church." "Then do you pray for him as for a founder?" "Yes, we do," answered the priest. "Do you curse him then during the week of Orthodoxy?" "Yes, we do, Your Majesty." "How bizarre," remarked the emperor, "to pray and curse at the same time." The architectural masterpiece erected thanks to Mazepa is the All Saints Church. The church is a real masterpiece of Mazepa Cossacks period. It was built by Moscow architect Aksamitov. It so happened that during the Polish rule, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was not allowed to build stone temples and could only use wood for building. When Cossacks regained power, they started building stone churches to commemorate the victory of the Orthodox over the Catholics in Ukraine. It was a real boom of stone architecture. Tens of the highest-ranked churches appeared in Hetmanshina, that is, lands under the Hetman rule, but there was a lack of foremen, so Mazepa often asked Peter I to help with architects. The church had been named after All Saints, as well as in honor of all the Pechersk saints, who were 537 in number. Mass canonization of all Pechersk saints was carried out by the famous Archimandrite and Metropolitan of Kiev Petro Mohyla. Petro Mohyla calculated how many relics were there in the caves. There were 117, and carried out the canonization. The All Saints Church wall featured Mazepa's coat of arms, which was later removed by the Emperor's order. Now it has been renewed, and the shortened title reads Ivan Stepanovich Mazepa, Zaporizhian Hetman. In fact, the title of Mazepa was much longer, It was a matter of prestige. All European monarchs were keen on having as many titles as possible. Moscow Tsars had tens of titles which they could not remember fully, and they signed with the help of etc., etc., etc. In this place, which is called the Economic Gate, as various materials and food for the Lavra were brought in through it, in the 11th century a historic episode took place during a fraternity riot. It happened while Theodosius was alive. It turned out that the monastery was out of food. The fraternity had only cooked wheat with honey for dinner and nothing else. The monks rebelled. Theodosius was unpleasantly surprised that monks were preoccupied with such primitive problems. Birds in the sky do not sow and do not reap, but they have their everyday food. So you should care for your soul's salvation. While Theodosius was speaking, someone knocked at the monastery gate. It turned out that one of the patrons had sent carts with food. This fact became a sort of illustration to the words of Theodosius of Pechersk. The All Saints' Church had wall paintings and an iconostasis. Now there is not so much from those old times left. During the Cossacks' times, the Lavra was under wardship of Mazepa's colonels and Mazepa himself. The Far Caves monastery was under guardianship of Colonel Makievsky, who had built the Church of the Holy Virgin's Nativity of 7 domes. The style is Baroque, low proportions, vast decoration, crooked facades that are absolutely adequate to the crookedness and turmoil of people's life on the earth. 7 domes are quite untraditional for Ukraine. In Ukraine, 5-dome and 3-dome cathedrals were much more widespread. Here 2 traditions are combined, 3 domes in the row together with the central one, according to the Ukrainian tradition, and 4 domes on the corners of the building according to the Moscow tradition. In the 18th century, a graceful bell tower had been built. It is pronouncedly higher than the cathedral itself. It is so because bell towers of the 18th century were built in honor of the then Russian Empire, in honor of the state. It is a distinctive triumph column in honor of monarchy. It was built by Hryhorovich Barsky, the best of the Ukrainian architects of the time, who followed the Rococo style. Instead of the Baroque drama, the lightness, graciousness and subtlety dominate here. Small towers hint at the ancient Gothic. They give an opportunity to look into the sky without any obstacle, and to feel peace and harmony of the universe created by God. When Zaporizhian Cossacks came to power, they invested much money into ancient monasteries in general and into the Lavra monasteries in particular. The monastery of the Near Caves was taken under wardship by Mazepa's colonel Pavlo Herceg. He built here the 3-dome Chrestovo-Zdvizhinska erection of the Cross Church. This patron of Ukrainian art was buried here. Herceg died earlier than Swedes were defeated at Poltava, but his daughter married Philip Orlik, and his relatives had to flee Ukraine together with Mazepa. When Mazepa died, not very long after he left Ukraine, Philip Orlik, who was Colonel Herceg's son-in-law, became the hetman in exile and fought together with Swedes under the yellow and blue Swedish flag. Philip Orlik tried to resolve Ukrainian problems fairly and encouraged European monarchs to do so as well. But none of them wanted to oppose Russia after Sweden suffered defeat in the war with Peter I. Besides, Philip Orlik spread word about Mazepa. Evidently, it was he who told Voltaire about Mazepa. The fact is that Voltaire devoted much attention to Mazepa in his History of Charles XII. Thanks to Voltaire, the image of Mazepa took an outstanding place in the European culture. A grandson of Herzog, who was buried here in the near caves, Rüher Orlik, married a French baroness, became a colonel general at the court of Louis XV, and was given some property near Paris, and the place was named after him, Orlik. As French people do not pronounce the last consonant in the word and put an accent on the last syllable, now it is pronounced Orly. Rüher Orlik took part in the 7 Years' War and was deadly wounded near Bergen. He stayed with the Goethe family, and little Wolfgang Goethe, who was the future author of Faust, took care of the French general, unaware that the grandfather of that general had been buried here in the near caves. In the 18th century, a huge belfry, which was nearly 100 meters high, was built near the Assumption Church. Its creator was Johann Gottfried Schedel, German by origin. In Ukrainian, his surname means skull, which sounds somewhat gloomy, but the building brought fame to Schedel. He also considered that erecting the tower really made him immortal, because it was 17 meters taller than the Ivan the Great belfry in Moscow Kremlin, and 7 meters taller than St. Stephen's belfry in Vienna, which is one of the most prominent architectural monuments of Europe. Possibly the belfry was an imperial order. In 1744, Elizabeth, the Empress of Russia, who came to the motherland of her husband Alexei Rozumovsky, stayed in the Lavra. She had a conversation with Schedel before he was going to finish the tower. It could be so that she gave him a piece of advice to build it taller than it was planned, because she was going to move to Kiev and to reside there. Every new capital had to be marked by the highest building. When Peter I, the father of Elizabeth, moved his residence to St. Petersburg, he erected there the Peter and Paul's belfry, which was 120 meters high and taller than any Moscow building. The belfry is a classic, mysterious and at the same time baroque in its style. It is colossal in weight thanks to voluminous decorative elements, but at the same time, this weight is overcome by an illusion that our glance is always pushed higher, so that we could see heaven and the universe, forget troubles of life on earth, and dream of the harmonious life in heaven. Imagination of people coming to the Lavra to worship the saints' relicts has created a poetic legends about the belfry being built by monks who every day erected a fragment of the wall, and after they fell asleep it sank down into the earth. Every day the same thing took place, and monks did their work again and again. After the building had been built this way up to 100 meters high, the belfry sprang out of the earth and showed itself like a rocket and dominated Kiev. Historians considered that if one gets to the highest point of the tower, he or she can watch lands of 3 provinces at a time. In fact, all of them can be seen without getting to the tower, because the Kiev province is the one we stand on, the Poltava province is quite close to the Kiev one in the district of Boryspil, and the Chernihiv province is situated on the left bank of the Dnipro. It is in these woods that legendary folk hero Ilya Muromets hunted an evil creature, Nightingale the Robber, in the old days. By the way, the relicts of Ilya Muromets are buried here in the near caves of the Lavra. In Schedel's lifetime, envious critics wrote that the building was too fragile to stand long, that he could not build firm buildings, and that the tower would fall down soon. However, it survived even the explosion of the Assumption Cathedral in 1941. There is an epithet belonging to poet Mykola Zerov, Shedal's miracle. The Near Caves monastery is situated on a hill, and in the 18th century there was a decision made to strengthen the hill so that it could not move, damaging the monastery buildings. This work was done by the architect de Bosquet. He reconstructed the side of the hill and strengthened it with stones. The wall gives an interesting romantic impression of a castle. There's hardly another fulcral wall in the world that would have a similar utilitarian function and produce such an aesthetic effect. The architectural complex of the monastery consists of two layers. These are Baroque ones of the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th centuries, with crooked line facades, broken lines, complicated silhouettes, and various asymmetries that precisely correspond to the restless earthly life. But there are also buildings of the beginning of the 19th century in classic style that were created by architect Malensky. He felt inspired by classic philosophy and the philosophy of Voltaireanist ideals. This philosophy interprets earthly life as the possible harmony, and it is harmonious, symmetric and peaceful forms that are presented in classic architecture. The philosophy of Baroque teaches that earthly life of man cannot be peaceful, normalized, foreseeable or harmonious. The idea of the religious philosophy of Baroque is that one can find peace only in heaven, if he or she deserves it. Baroque architecture stretches high to the sky, while classic architecture is stocky, earthly, and does not call our sight to the skies. Voltaire said, "It is necessary to live the way that gives happiness on earth. Let us give the sky to birds and return to the earth." Classic architecture is the one that brings one down to earth. We can see the fortification wall around the far and near caves that had been built according to an order by Tsar Nicholas I in the 19th century. He prepared for the war with France and expected that Frenchmen, together with Turks, would go to Moscow through Kiev. That is why Kiev had to be strengthened. There was a new Pechersk fortress built, mighty and made of stone. The wall is connected to another one that had been built earlier by Mazepa. It has wider embrasures for cannons and narrower ones for guns. But expectations of Tsar Nicholas did not come true. The Crimean campaign, that is the war with France, took place generally in the south and did not reach Kiev, so the wall is a memorial of the fortification architecture of the 19th century as well as a monument to bureaucratic squandering. At the end of the 19th century, under the influence of the nationalistic policy of Russian Tsars, the Lavra artists had to back off far to Byzantine times. The matter is that Nicholas I hated Europe, considered it to be rotten, and thought that Russia stood much higher than Europe. That is why, while visiting Kiev and observing a number of European features, and Baroque among them, he said that the churches had to be returned into a savage state, that is, they had to regain a real Orthodox spirit of the Byzantine character, and so it was necessary to minimize the European form's impact. That was the reason why in the 19th century a big purge began. Europeanized paintings of the 18th century had been destroyed and substituted with the so-called Byzantine ones. But they did not know the Byzantine style well enough. Only static postures were chosen from all the numerous achievements of the Byzantine style. Conservatives were very much irritated by the Lavra's architecture as well. In order to bring Orthodox Byzantium accent to the Lavra's architecture at the end of the 19th century, the Baroque refectory was destroyed, and another one, according to the Byzantine style, had been built instead. It is still in existence. Architect Nikolaev, who built the church, made a superbly wide dome, an imitation of Sophia Constantinople Cathedral. Its diameter is 12 meters wide, while the diameter of Sophia is 40 meters wide. Nevertheless, the dome reminds us of Byzantium and Constantinople. Construction and decoration of the refectory church and the refectory chamber involved young architect Shushev. He was famous for his Byzantine Old Rus-style churches he built in Ukraine and Russia. He was very active, building 49 churches until 1917. It was a very significant service, and the Holy Synod promised Shushev that he would be canonized as a saint in his lifetime after building his 50th church. But he did not manage to build the 50th church because of the Great October Revolution. Church construction was stopped, and the architect's 50th building turned out to be the Lenin Mausoleum in the Red Square in Moscow. So Shushev had been canonized, but by the Soviet power. He is considered to have been a really prominent architect, and every city of the former Soviet Union seemed to have a street named after him. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Lavra painters, under the guidance of Ivan Yezhakevich, made wall paintings in a new decorative manner which is now called the modern style. The Lavra always had an eye out for modern artistic trends. It was not isolated from the art in general, and perhaps if the monastery had existed longer, it would have come to feature wall paintings in the modern style. There were two artists who worked there. One of them, Chikrihin, belonged to Futurist school and was the first illustrator of Mayakovsky's poems. Another one was his friend Redko. Young artists of the Lavra, they became interested in Picasso's inventions. Some Kievites knew Picasso in person. Those were woman artist Exter and sculptor Arhipenko. Redko remembers how they had found a reproduction of one of Picasso's cubist works. They went to the bank of the river and speculated on this new tendency in art. Redko had never thought at the time that in some 2 decades he would make friends with Picasso while in Paris. According to Redko's memoirs, he was very proud to get a present from Picasso, the artist's own sweater. There are 3 chestnut trees in the Soborna Square left from those ancient times. There were 10 of them then. They were planted in 1863 and are nearly 140 years old. The Assumption Cathedral lived through many centuries, being ruined from time to time, repaired, or as it was then called, restored. In 1941 it was destroyed. It took place at the beginning of the German occupation of Kyiv. It is known that before Kyiv was left by Soviet troops, nearly the whole city had been mined, according to Stalin's order. The Lavra was mined too. It was called burnt-out earth tactics. The Nazis managed to clear the belfry of mines, but who pushed the button and destroyed the Assumption Cathedral is not known. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium, the Assumption Cathedral was rebuilt thanks to the efforts of the President of Ukraine and the Mayor of Kyiv. It is necessary to note that the Lavra has always been an example of Christian virtue, and its monks have always been kind and respectful to all people. At the same time, Monks of the Lavra sometimes witnessed bigotry and cruelty inside its walls. So it was, for instance, in the 11th century, when Volodymyr Monomach's brother Rostislav drowned monk Grigory, who foresaw the defeat in a battle to which he was going. Being very angry and having a semi-pagan soul, Rostislav killed Grigory, which made a bad impact on Volodymyr Monomach's reputation. Because of the fact that his brother turned out to be such a barbarian, Kiev did not invite Monomach to rule the country, though he believed in God and forgave very hard sins to his enemies. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Lavra witnessed some pathological cruelty once again. Red Army soldiers conquered Kiev and killed senior priest of the monastery, Father Volodymyr. Before his death, Volodymyr prayed for his assassins, following the example of Jesus Christ. The Lavra history is a kind of model of Ukrainian history. It prospered at the time when Ukraine had its statehood, Kievan Rus, a mighty state of Orthodox Christianity. The monastery comes to life. It prospers and becomes a big source of the Christian philosophy. Then comes the time when Kiev loses its capital status. Russian capital moves to Vladimir than to Moscow. Kiev metropolitans go to Moscow, to Vladimir, or to Vilnius. The Lavra cannot boast prosperity, though the monastery life goes on. Then come the Cossacks' times. The Ukrainian statehood is renewed. This gives a great cultural boost, which is felt in the Lavra too. Ancient churches are renewed, decorated and modernized by the Cossacks. These two most famous periods in Ukrainian history created an image of the modern Lavra. All the later art and architectural works do not show the level that was reached during Kievan Rus and Cossack state of the 17th and the 18th centuries. Then the Lavra fell into the Bolsheviks' hands and monasteries were closed or destroyed, something which even Russian Empress Catherine II did not dare to do. In spite of being a Voltaire follower and closing down monasteries in the 18th century, she did not touch the Lavra. The Bolsheviks were much more daring. The fact that the Lavra had been transformed into a museum and a source of anti-religious propaganda in the Soviet times helped, however, to save it to a certain extent. Christianity, as the main antidote for human cruelty and sadism, has been safeguarded by the Lavra. The Lavra's main merit is that it has spread to people all the basic Christian postulates. Thanks to the Lavra, Christian ideas have been planted into the consciousness and subconsciousness of our nation so deeply that nothing will ever force them out.